Alright everyone, tonight we're kicking things off with a creature that's shaped human history more profoundly than a huge chunk of the kings we've ever known. The dog. So before you settle in, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely dig what I'm doing here. And drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always super interesting to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe. Now, let's dim those lights, maybe flick on a fan for that subtle ambient hum, and ease our way into tonight's adventure together. The Ice Age wasn't some feel-good, snowy wonderland where everyone learns about the power of friendship. Nope. It was a full-blown frozen nightmare dreamt up by nature's most sadistic in turn. Temperatures were trying to off you, predators were trying to off you, and even your own campfire would occasionally try to betray you by collapsing right into your lap. Humanity pulled through thanks to a mix of sheer stubbornness, questionable decision-making, and the occasional stroke of dumb luck. One of those lucky accidents sparked what would become the greatest friendship in history. Picture this. You're bundled up in animal skins that reek of regret and mildew, huddling next to a fire that barely deserves to be called warm. Your whole clan looks like a bunch of exhausted raccoons sporting hats made out of other raccoons. Dinner? A slab of mammoth meat so burnt it basically qualifies as charcoal. Morale is in the toilet, hygiene is a distant memory. And hope? Hope is just some fairy tale. Then you hear it. A low growl echoing from the darkness. It's not subtle, it's not friendly. It's the kind of growl that screams, I am seriously considering making you and your footwear my next meal. It's wolves. Because of course it is. These wolves have been scoping out your camp all day, silently judging your pathetic hunting skills. They basically see you as a walking disappointment with a pulse. But tonight, something different happens. Out of the shadows steps the world's least impressive wolf. A scrawny, socially awkward, bottom-of-the-pack reject. We're talking about the kind of wolf who gets bullied by squirrels. He's starving, he's desperate, and he's clearly making some questionable life choices, like approaching humans armed with spears and crippling anxiety. He creeps closer to the firelight. The humans are internally panicking. The wolf plops down like he owns the place. Everyone freezes, nobody wants to be the first course. The wolf stares at your mammoth bone with the exact same expression modern dogs use when you crack open a bag of chips. Then, in an act of ancient stupidity that would change everything, someone throws him a scrap. Not out of kindness, not out of hope, but just a desperate, maybe if he eats this, he won't eat me. The wolf snatches the scrap and trots back into the darkness, his tail twitching in what might be gratitude or just indigestion. The next night, he's back. And the next, and the next. Soon, he's sitting closer, sleeping nearby, growling at other predators like he's suddenly working security for the camp. The humans tolerate him because, honestly, life is just easier when something with sharp teeth is on your side. Little by little, the killer becomes the freeloader becomes the companion, and the creature that once hunted us becomes the first ever dog. All because two species were too cold, too hungry, and too damn tired to kill each other. Once the world's least intimidating wolf realized that humans were basically a walking all-you-can-eat buffet of half-cooked disappointment, he brought friends. Not the cool alpha wolves, no way. Those wolves had standards. These were the outcasts, the weirdos, the wolves whose own mother sighed when they looked at them. The kind of wolves who stared at their reflection in a frozen pond and thought, I'm trying my best, okay? These wolves discovered humanity's greatest invention long before fire, agriculture, or the wheel, the garbage pile. To Ice Age wolves, the human trash heap was like stumbling into a Michelin star restaurant where the chef is blindfolded and hates his job. Burnt bones, meat scraps, fat trimmings, stuff humans threw away because even starving people were like, absolutely not. Wolves loved it. To them, it was gourmet. Before long, these wolves started hanging around the very edges of the camp, close enough to smell the stew, which smelled like sadness, but far enough to bolt if anyone threw a rock. It was a relationship built on fear, caution, and an extremely low bar for fine dining. Humans, for their part, realized something magical. The wolves that stuck around were the ones that didn't immediately try to rip off your leg. This was a valuable trait back in the Ice Age. So, the dynamic evolved. Wolves approached camp. Humans gripped their spears. Wolves put on their best, I'm harmless and pathetic face. Humans sighed, tossed a bone, and muttered about how this wasn't their job. Night after night, the wolves who were the least aggressive, or the most desperately hungry, kept coming back. And slowly, these wolves began to change. Not spiritually, not philosophically. Evolution simply said, let's make these things smaller, dumber, and more appealing to humans who clearly love a fixer-upper. Snouts shortened, eyes widened, and tail wagging accidentally evolved. Likely from one wolf who got a little too excited about leftovers and discovered it earned him even more leftovers. Gradually, the wolves became less, I might eat your children, and more, I'm here for snacks and emotional support. But the wolves weren't doing charity. They got something out of this, too: warmth from human fires, protection from larger predators, and a stable food supply, assuming the humans caught anything that day. Occasional mammoth jerky, because desperation makes cooks generous. Evolution had pulled off something extraordinary. It turned a deadly predator into the world's first professional trash eater. And humans, for once, felt slightly safer. Not because they were stronger, not because they were smarter, but because a wolf with zero ambition decided humans were easier to live with than other wolves. Welcome to the birth of domestication, the laziest yet most successful partnership in history. Domestication wasn't some magical moment where a wolf suddenly rolled over and said, I think I'll be adorable now. No, it was thousands of years of slow, reluctant evolution, mostly driven by hunger, laziness, and the realization that biting humans was a bad career move. At this point, the wolves hanging around human camps weren't exactly wolves anymore. They were wolf-shaped disappointments. The runts, the socially anxious, the ones who couldn't hunt, couldn't fight, and probably failed basic wolf school. If wolves had student loans, these were the ones defaulting. But these were also the wolves who discovered something revolutionary. Acting slightly less murdery gets you free food. This was the dawn of survival through cuteness. A wolf with a slightly rounder face gets more leftovers. A wolf who doesn't growl at toddlers gets invited closer to the fire. A wolf whose tail wiggles instead of thrashing in rage gets noises, a sound that triggers the ancient human instinct to give away snacks. And so, generation after generation, these camp wolves changed. Not dramatically, not instantly, but slowly, like a bad haircut growing out. Their skulls shrank, their teeth softened, and their eyes widened into the expression scientists now classify as emotionally manipulative. Wolves became dogs the same way people become influencers, by performing harmless behavior until someone pays attention. Meanwhile, humans began to notice something else. These newly evolved proto-dogs didn't just stop attacking, they started helping, kind of. One wolf might bark when a predator approached. Another might trail behind hunters, hoping for scraps and accidentally contributing to the hunt. A third might simply sit in camp, offering emotional support to someone who just lost a fight with a berry bush. Humans looked at these creatures, smaller than wolves, friendlier than wolves, and 10 times less competent than wolves, and thought, this one might survive if I protect it. So they did. The strong wolves died out. The cute, needy, clingy ones thrived. Evolution applauded this new strategy called being adorable. And thus the great transformation continued. From predator to scavenger, from scavenger to sidekick, from sidekick to creature that sleeps in your bed and steals half your pillow. The murder instinct faded. The feed me instinct intensified. And humanity found itself raising the world's first professional loaf-shaped companion. By the time proto-dogs had fully committed to the less murder, more mooching lifestyle, humans began to realize something shocking. These little ex-wolves were actually useful. Not very competent, not very coordinated, but useful in the way a loud, anxious roommate is useful. They might not help with chores, but they will certainly yell when something sketchy happens. Dogs became the world's first alarm systems. Picture a prehistoric night. The wind is howling, the fire is crackling, and your clan is trying to sleep through the sound of someone snoring like a dying mammoth. Suddenly, a rustle comes from the darkness. Before humans can even reach their spears, one of the camp dogs erupts into frantic barking. Not brave, not heroic, just incredibly loud. Loud enough to wake the dead. Loud enough to make predators reconsider their life choices. This was revolutionary. Humans had invented nothing that could do this. The security system they had before dogs consisted of listening for trouble and hoping your ears worked. Crying dogs changed that. They barked at predators, strangers, shadows, suspicious rocks, their own tail. Basically anything they decided was terrifying at that moment. And although prehistoric humans had many problems, sleep deprivation from dog barking was probably their first shared universal experience. But dogs weren't just noise machines. They were territorial. They adopted the camp as their domain. The same wolf who once considered humans trail mix with limbs now patrolled around the fire like an overworked bouncer. Humans appreciated this. They rewarded it with scraps, pets, and constant enabling, the same dynamic that still exists between dogs and humans today. Soon, dogs discovered another superpower, tracking things better than humans ever could. They could smell predators before humans even sensed danger. They could tell the difference between harmless noises and something that actually wanted to eat you. And though dogs rarely fought predators directly, bravery was still a work in progress. They excelled at loudly announcing danger and then bravely hiding behind humans. And humans, for their part, began viewing these messy, needy, tail-wagging creatures not as wild animals, but as allies. Dogs weren't perfect. They still stole food. They still made bad choices. They still panicked at absolutely nothing. But for the first time in prehistory, humans had something watching their backs, something loyal, something protective, something that occasionally did the right thing on purpose. The Ice Age was still brutal. But now, humans didn't face the darkness alone. By now, early dogs weren't just scavengers or furry alarm clocks. They were becoming partners on the most miserable team sport in human history: Ice Age hunting. A sport where the rules were simple: catch something or starve. Preferably catch something that won't immediately catch you back. Humans were decent hunters, sure. They had spears, teamwork, and the ability to complain loudly about everything. But dogs had superpowers. Noses that could detect prey from miles away, ears that twitched at the faintest snap of a twig, and energy levels that made humans seriously reconsider their own stamina. A typical hunt went something like this. Humans spot a herd of something large, angry, and equipped with horns capable of rearranging your skeletal system. Dogs notice it, too, usually before humans, then start barking like unpaid interns desperate to impress their boss. The noise startles the prey, which either runs away or charges forward, depending on the animal's mood and sense of humor. The dogs sprint ahead, fueled by excitement, adrenaline, and absolutely no thoughts whatsoever. Humans follow behind, fueled by hunger, fear, and the knowledge that their winter coat is literally falling apart. Together, they form the world's first dysfunctional hunting party. Surprisingly, it works. Dogs chase prey into traps. Dogs flush animals from hiding spots. Dogs track wounded creatures through forests humans would get lost in instantly. Dogs do all the dangerous legwork while humans show up at the end and throw spears like they contributed equally. And the best part? Dogs think this is fun. They have no concept of risk assessment. They don't understand fatal consequences. They're just thrilled to be involved in anything that isn't freezing to death or barking at a leaf. Of course, not every dog was a born hunter. Some dogs got distracted by butterflies. Some chased the wrong animal for 2 hours. Some ran off entirely and returned with a stick, proudly convinced they'd solved hunger forever. But humans tolerated all of this because even the stupidest dog occasionally helped catch something edible. Ice Age hunting with dogs wasn't perfect, but it was better, faster, more successful, and most importantly, it bonded humans and dogs in shared triumph and shared trauma. There's nothing like being nearly trampled by a mammoth together to build trust. And slowly, humans began to realize these creatures weren't just useful. They were becoming essential partners, companions, something dangerously close to friends. Somewhere between barking at predators and chasing mammoths with questionable enthusiasm, dogs crossed a line. They moved in. Not in a formal sign this lease agreement way, more in a I'm cold, you're warm, and this arrangement benefits me more than you way. And humans, worn down by the Ice Age and poor decision-making, let it happen. Originally, dogs slept near the edges of campfires. Not too close. Humans smelled weird and made unpredictable noises in their sleep, but close enough to enjoy the heat. Then, one especially bold dog decided he was tired of frostbite and simply walked into a human shelter like he owned the place. Humans stared. The dog stared back. Then he curled up in the corner and acted like this was completely normal. And just like that, humanity lost the living room. At first, only a few dogs did this. The bravest, the dumbest, the ones who confused danger with opportunity. But soon enough, more followed. They realized humans had invented blankets. Primitive, smelly blankets, yes, but soft enough compared to sleeping on frozen dirt. Humans protested at first. They complained. They pushed the dogs away. And then, when the temperature dropped to, "Why are we alive?" they reluctantly pulled the dogs closer. Nothing warms a frigid shelter like a 50-pound fluffy space heater that occasionally snores. This was the moment everything changed. Dogs started treating human camps as their dens. They guarded them without being asked. They growled at strangers, barked at weird noises, and woke everyone up at 3 a.m. because a pine cone moved in a threatening way. Humans didn't realize it yet, but the domestication process was complete. The dogs weren't living with humans. The humans were living with dogs. Dogs claimed the warmest sleeping spots. Dogs ate the best scraps. Dogs inserted themselves into family matters like furry diplomats. Dogs decided who could approach the camp and who couldn't. Dogs even tried to help with chores, which mostly resulted in chaos, but was appreciated nonetheless. And the strangest part? Humans didn't hate it. Despite the fur everywhere, the constant barking, the occasional stolen food, and the fact that dogs absolutely did not respect personal space, humans grew attached, emotionally, deeply. Because dogs did something no Ice Age human expected. They made life less miserable. The nights didn't feel so long. The cold felt less cruel. And for the first time in human history, someone greeted you with joy simply because you existed. The partnership was sealed not by blood, not by ritual, but by warmth, leftovers, and loneliness. As the Ice Age thawed and humanity collectively decided it preferred not dying of frostbite, civilization finally sprouted. And with it, dogs strutted right into the spotlight like they were auditioning for a historical documentary. And nowhere did they shine brighter than ancient Egypt, the land of gold, gods, pyramids, and an alarming enthusiasm for shaving things. Egyptians took one look at dogs and said, "Yes, this creature clearly has divine potential," which is funny considering dogs were still rolling in questionable substances and eating whatever fell on the ground. But the Egyptians admired loyalty, courage, and a good set of teeth, qualities dogs had in abundance. Unlike half the royal court, dogs guarded homes, herded livestock, and accompanied hunters into marshes filled with hippos, crocodiles, and birds who looked like they held grudges. Egyptian hunters trusted their dogs more than their fellow nobles. And honestly, who could blame them? But Egypt took dog appreciation to new heights. Literally, they immortalized dogs in tomb paintings. They carved dogs into statues. They painted them on pottery. Some nobles even had their dogs buried beside them so they could continue peeing on sacred objects in the afterlife. And then there was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death, embalming. And please don't haunt me, but Egyptians claimed he wasn't technically based on dogs. Let's be honest, ancient Egyptian jackals looked suspiciously like street dogs with eyeliner. The divine message was clear. Dogs were respected, feared, loved, and rumored to work part-time guiding souls into the underworld. Despite all this worship, Egyptians also had a terrible habit. They shaved their dogs, not for cleanliness or health reasons, but because bald dogs were considered fashionable. Imagine a majestic hunting dog, proud and skilled, suddenly shaved until it resembled a confused, shivering rat with existential questions. That was Egyptian style. Still, dogs in Egypt lived better lives than most peasants. They had names. They had collars. They had fan art. Some even had funerals more elaborate than your average taxpayer. If reincarnation is real, you definitely wanted to come back as an Egyptian noble's dog, not his servant. In Egypt, dogs were no longer just camp companions. They were symbols of protection, friendship, loyalty, And the universal truth. Dogs were already our best friends. Humans were just finally catching up. By the time dogs reached ancient Greece, they had survived the Ice Age, found religion in Egypt, and were now ready to deal with something far more stressful. Greek philosophers. Wolves had once faced mammoths. Dogs had once faced starvation. But nothing prepared them for a toga-wearing intellectual trying to explain ethics for 6 hours straight. In Greece, dogs were everywhere. In workshops, marketplaces, gymnasiums, yes, Greeks exercised a lot, and most importantly, in philosophical schools. And if you're wondering what dogs were doing there, the answer is simple. Sleeping through lectures. Dogs have always understood that the correct response to a man explaining the nature of truth is to take a nap. Yet the Greeks admired dogs deeply. They saw dogs as symbols of loyalty, bravery, and moral clarity. Everything the average Athenian citizen lacked. Greek warriors used dogs for protection. Farmers used them to guard flocks. Hunters used them to chase down prey. And philosophers used them as metaphors, because apparently no discussion of virtue was complete without mentioning a good boy. But the funniest part? There was an entire philosophical movement named after dogs. The Cynics. The word cynic literally means dog-like. Not because they were loyal, no, but because they lived simply, barked at society's nonsense, refused to follow rules, and occasionally peed in public to make a point. Dogs would have been proud. Socrates praised dogs for their ability to tell friend from enemy. Plato compared dogs to ideal guardians. Aristotle claimed dogs had a form of practical wisdom, which is ironic considering this was an era when dogs still ate rocks for fun. Meanwhile, Greek households adored their dogs and treated them surprisingly well. They gave them names like Foxy, Whitey, Growler, and Blitzer, proving that humans have always been bad at naming things. Dogs lounged in courtyards, begged for food in tavern entrances, and inserted themselves into family life with zero boundaries. But Greek dogs also had jobs, real jobs. They guarded temples. They herded goats. They accompanied soldiers into battle, something Socrates politely declined to do. They even protected entire city gates at night, barking at suspicious noises and occasionally at absolutely nothing, continuing a proud tradition still practiced today. In the classical world, dogs weren't just companions. They were co-workers, bodyguards, sleep aids for bored philosophers, and furry symbols of everything humans wanted to be but rarely achieved. And the Greeks understood one thing better than anyone. Dogs live simply, love deeply, and judge silently, which makes them wiser than most philosophers. When dogs reached ancient Rome, they discovered something terrifying. An empire that tried to militarize absolutely everything. If Rome could weaponize it, it did. If it couldn't weaponize it, Rome conquered it anyway and wrote a manual about why weaponizing it was a great idea. Naturally, dogs didn't escape this treatment. Romans looked at dogs, loyal, fast, and emotionally available, and said, yes, perfect, let's put armor on it. Enter the Roman war dog, an animal who did not sign up for this job. These dogs, often mastiffs or massive Malachian breeds, marched alongside legions, wearing spiked collars and occasionally chainmail. Imagine being a barbarian warrior, psyching yourself up for battle, only to see a huge armored dog charging at you like the world's angriest kitchen appliance. Roman commanders loved these dogs, not for their cuteness, that emotion was banned from the military, but for their ability to intimidate enemies and bite things on command. War dogs guarded camps, delivered messages, attacked intruders, and most importantly, stole food from soldiers who were already starving. A true multitasker. But it wasn't all war and violence. Romans also adored dogs at home. Wealthy families kept lapdogs with names like Fiddle, Little One, and Bitey. These tiny dogs slept on silk cushions, ate scraps from banquets, and definitely judged every guest who entered the villa. Meanwhile, Roman soldiers on the frontier shared their rations with giant shaggy dogs who smelled like battle and potatoes. Roman farmers used dogs to guard livestock. Merchants used them to protect caravans. Even Roman priests used dogs during certain rituals, though the dogs probably had no idea why they were there and assumed it involved snacks. And of course, being Romans, they recorded everything. We have tombstones dedicated to beloved pets, complete with poetic inscriptions like, I am in tears while carrying you to your last resting place. As much as I rejoiced when bringing you home in my own hands, a level of emotion Romans rarely showed to actual humans. But the most ironic part? For all their glorification of war, conquest, and discipline, Rome still bowed quietly, privately to the emotional power of dogs. A dog could guard an empire. A dog could march with legions. A dog could serve in battle with courage no senator ever possessed. Yet at night, after the fighting, even the toughest Roman soldier rested easier with a dog curled at his feet. Because in Rome, as everywhere else, dogs weren't just warriors. They were family. As the Roman Empire puffed itself up across Europe, and the Greeks debated everything from ethics to the meaning of chairs, dogs were quietly doing something far more impressive. Conquering the world without trying. No strategy, no legions, no diplomacy, just pause, charm, and zero understanding of borders. The moment humanity built the Silk Road, that long, dusty highway stretching from China to the Mediterranean, dogs looked at it and thought, "Nice a walk," and off they went. Wherever merchants traveled, across deserts, mountains, and cities, dogs followed. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes because a merchant dropped a dumpling, sometimes because a dog woke up from a nap and realized it was 600 miles from home and simply rolled with it. Caravans heading from China to Persia had the same three constants. Camels complaining, merchants complaining louder, and dogs who complained about nothing but still ate the most. Dogs became the Silk Road's unofficial employees. They guarded tents at night, chased thieves, and scared off animals that wanted to eat the merchandise. Traders learned one important truth. You can trust a dog more than a business partner. Different cultures began swapping more. Beyond silk, the Silk Road was a vibrant exchange of life itself. Breeds of dogs mingled as Persian traders encountered Chinese caravans, perhaps eyeing a fluffy companion and musing, "My wife will either adore this creature or use it as a projectile." Suddenly, Pekingese dogs, like tiny, grumpy diplomats, were traversing continents. Meanwhile, hardy shepherd dogs from Central Asia journeyed westward, joining nomadic tribes and guarding their livestock from wolves who, apparently, missed the memo about dogs now being on Team Human. Every stop along the Silk Road added a new chapter to the canine saga. In India, dogs found temples to guard and scraps to pilfer. In Persia, they protected caravans while affecting an air of nobility. Central Asian canines befriended fearless horsemen. And in China, they became pampered palace pets, silently judging everyone, no doubt. Dogs didn't just spread biologically. They spread culturally. Stories about them were shared, merchants traded them, and kings demanded them as gifts. Entire populations reshaped their views of wolves because of these dogs, sniffing their way across vast empires. By the time the Silk Road hit its stride, dogs had achieved something remarkable. They'd become the first global citizens, all by following humans who dropped crumbs. While humans were busy mapping trade routes, building empires, and squabbling over territory, dogs simply existed. And somehow that was enough for them to take over the world. As civilizations grew wealthier, more extravagant, and increasingly obsessed with showing off, dogs entered a new era. The status symbol era. They ceased to be mere hunters, guards, or living alarm systems, becoming luxury items, fashion accessories, and indicators of wealth. Living proof that one's social standing was so elevated that they could afford a creature that did absolutely nothing. In wealthy Greek households, owning a fancy dog was the ancient equivalent of flaunting a sports car on Instagram. The more exotic the breed, the more people assumed you were ridiculously rich and devoid of real problems. Aristocrats paraded through markets with elegant, fluffy dogs in tow, while the dogs themselves seemed perpetually bewildered by their new surroundings. Why are there marble statues everywhere? Why is everyone shouting about democracy? Rome, however, took this concept to Olympic levels. Roman nobles kept toy dogs so minuscule they could fit inside sleeves. Dogs that, from an evolutionary standpoint, had no right to exist. These miniature, trembling creatures didn't hunt, didn't guard, and didn't bark with any real authority. Their primary function was to lounge on silk pillows and look disapproving. And many excelled at it. Professional dog breeders emerged, tailoring dogs specifically for wealthy households and likely inventing half the modern dog problems we grapple with today. Overbred snouts, fragile bones, and anxiety disorders passed down through generations of palace gossip. But it wasn't just about small dogs. Wealthy elites also favored massive breeds. Enormous Molossan beasts capable of guarding estates, intimidating rivals, and accidentally crushing the occasional piece of furniture. Owning one was the ancient equivalent of saying, "I have power. Also, I might die if it decides to sit on me." Dogs also began appearing in art. Every self-respecting noble wanted their portrait painted with a dog at their side, a testament to their sophistication, loyalty, and emotional depth. Although, judging by surviving sculptures, some nobles clearly loved their dogs more than their spouses. As empire after empire embraced dog culture, one thing became clear: dogs were no longer just animals. They were social markers, political statements, symbols of taste, wealth, refinement, and, occasionally, delusion. The dog who once hunted mammoths now lounged in marble villas, feasting on roasted duck. The wolf who once survived by chasing deer now survived by being adorable enough to avoid banishment. And humanity didn't mind at all, because nothing screams, "I'm wealthy and important," quite like a creature who contributes nothing and still gets treated like royalty. Welcome to medieval Europe, where the average peasant's life expectancy hovered between "don't get your hopes up" and "the plague is coming again." If you were poor, which was everyone except like 3 people, your daily routine involved working from sunrise until you could no longer feel your limbs, eating bread that could break your teeth, and desperately trying not to catch a disease that starts with a cough and ends with a burial. Amid this chaos, dogs became indispensable. Not as luxury ornaments or status symbols, but as actual survival equipment. The medieval peasant had 3 lines of defense against disaster: a wooden door that didn't quite close properly, prayer, and a dog that barked at absolutely everything. Medieval watchdogs weren't the glamorous warriors of Roman legions. They were scruffy, muddy, vaguely potato-shaped creatures who smelled of compost and questionable decisions. But they were loyal, alert, and always ready to sound the alarm, even if the threat was just a suspiciously rustling leaf. These dogs patrolled village fences, guarded livestock, and escorted peasants home after long days in the fields. They weren't pampered, they weren't brushed, and they certainly weren't fed high-quality medieval kibble. Their diet consisted largely of table scraps, stale bread, and unidentifiable things they found on the ground. Yet, medieval peasants adored them in their own way. A dog might sleep by the hearth, a generous term for a pile of burning sticks, warm the children during winter, and chase off thieves desperate enough to rob someone who owned nothing. Dogs were essentially furry housemates who kept predators at bay: wolves, foxes, or the occasional drunk knight who mistook your cottage for his castle. But the partnership was mutual. Dogs got warmth, a human family, and a reliable food source, even if that food tasted like disappointment. They also got affection. Not fancy collars or velvet cushions, but pats on the head and a life free from pack politics. Medieval dogs worked for a living. They herded sheep, guarded granaries, and patrolled muddy roads with the seriousness of a knight defending his honor, though knights usually smelled better. In the hierarchy of village life, peasants were at the bottom, but dogs were somewhere just above peasants and below the local priest. And honestly, they earned it, because while medieval Europe battled plague, famine, taxes, raiders, and more plague, these loyal animals stayed by humanity's side, barking their hopeless little barks into the darkness. And somehow it helped. If medieval peasants had dogs for survival, medieval nobles had dogs for something far more dramatic: status, ego, and emotional support during political meltdowns. Dogs in castles lived lives so vastly different from village dogs that you'd think they were entirely separate species. Peasant dogs slept on dirt floors. Noble dogs slept on cushions stuffed with goose feathers and the suffering of the lower classes. Castles were chaotic places, filled with scheming nobles, bored knights, moody princes, and at least one suspiciously unhinged jester. Into this medieval soap opera stepped the castle hound. Massive, muscular, loyal, and usually better behaved than every human in the building. Nobles loved hunting, mostly because it gave them an excuse to avoid governing. Their hounds were essential for this. These dogs were trained to track boar, chase deer, and ignore the existential screams of peasants as they watched their livestock vanish into the woods again. Castle hounds were serious professionals, unlike the nobles who owned them. Picture a hunting scene. A noble knight in a shiny helmet he can't see out of, a group of servants doing all the actual work, and a pack of hounds sprinting ahead, thinking, "Finally, someone is letting us do our job instead of forcing us to sit through another banquet." These hounds were elite, strong, fast, and loyal. They guarded castles, patrolled courtyards, and politely refrained from eating messengers most of the time. Some castles even had entire rooms dedicated to dogs, warmer than the servants' quarters, naturally. Meanwhile, noble ladies kept smaller dogs, delicate little creatures who spent their days on velvet cushions, receiving more affection than most husbands. These miniature dogs never hunted, never guarded, and never contributed anything except the occasional dramatic fainting spell. They were, in essence, medieval influencers. Dogs in the noble world were also emotional anchors. Knights heading to war hugged their dogs, lords confided in them, and queens fed them scraps under the table during political dinners, where everyone pretended to like each other. Dogs understood palace secrets better than the royal scribes, and they could keep them too. But the real comedy was that, no matter how fancy their surroundings or how expensive their collars, castle dogs still behaved like dogs. They chased chickens, stole bread, barked at ghosts, and refused to come when called, because even wrapped in luxury, a dog will always be a dog. And medieval nobles needed that kind of honest chaos more than they ever admitted. By the time Europe stumbled into the Renaissance, humans had rediscovered art, science, architecture, philosophy, and, most importantly, how to spoil dogs even more than the nobility already had. This was the age of genius. Michelangelo sculpted gods, Leonardo sketched helicopters, and Renaissance nobles invented something truly revolutionary: the extremely pampered lap dog. In Renaissance courts, dogs experienced the kind of glow-up usually reserved for reality TV contestants. These tiny velvet pillow creatures didn't descend from wolves so much as they descended from anxiety. They trembled constantly, demanded attention, and were carried everywhere because their legs were apparently decorative. Ladies of high society adored them. A noblewoman would glide through a palace wearing 40 pounds of silk, her hair stacked higher than her social expectations, and at her side sat a 4-pound dog that looked like it hadn't hunted anything larger than a crouton in its entire life. This dog ate better than 98% of the population and contributed absolutely nothing beyond being cute enough to justify its existence. But the Renaissance wasn't all about tiny dogs. This was also a golden age for hunting breeds. Kings and dukes bred enormous, elegant hounds designed to sprint after deer at speeds that made knights seriously rethink their cardio routines. Hunting was no longer strictly practical. It was performance art, men in tights chasing deer while dogs did all the real work, a Renaissance aesthetic. Meanwhile, artists became obsessed with painting dogs. Portraits of noble families almost always included a dog sitting proudly at their feet, looking more dignified than half the people in the room. In these paintings, dogs symbolized loyalty, virtue, and a reminder that someone in the household had actual emotional intelligence. And then there were the weird little spaniels who sat in ladies' laps during long carriage rides, balls, banquets, political negotiations, and marriages arranged by people who absolutely shouldn't have been in charge. These dogs served a crucial Renaissance function, keeping their owners from having a public meltdown. Royal courts were full of drama, betrayal, gossip, poisoning attempts, and fashion disasters. Having a tiny dog on your lap gave you at least one reason not to flip a banquet table. But whether tiny and fluffy or tall and regal, Renaissance dogs shared one unifying truth. They had successfully risen from Ice Age scavengers to elite members of the world's fanciest households, all without doing anything except being lovable and alive. After thousands of years of chaos, evolution, cultural drama, and truly questionable grooming choices, looking at you, ancient Egypt, we arrive at the end of our journey, where dogs officially solidify their position as humanity's first and best friend. Not by conquest, not by political treaties, but by simply being the most persistent freeloaders in history. Think about it. No other species has successfully infiltrated every era, Every culture, every household, every couch. Dogs did what empires failed to do. Rome collapsed, Egypt fell, the Renaissance ended, and human trends came and went. But dogs just kept showing up, tail wagging, asking for snacks. By the late Renaissance, dogs had mastered humanity. They'd figured out the formula. Be cute, provide emotional support, stare intensely while humans eat, pretend to understand commands, profit. They evolved from wolves who hunted mammoths into creatures who now panic when their owner leaves the room for 30 seconds. They went from sleeping in snowdrifts to sleeping diagonally across an entire king-sized bed, forcing humans into uncomfortable L-shapes throughout the night. And here's the secret no historian likes to admit. Dogs didn't just become our best friends. They tricked us into becoming theirs. Think about the emotional manipulation. Dogs tilt their heads, humans melt. Dogs whine softly, humans hand over food. Dogs look sad for 0.5 seconds, humans apologize for existing. Meanwhile, dogs give us unconditional love, loyalty, protection, companionship, and enough fur to knit an entire medieval cloak every week. They guard us, comfort us, and greet us with the enthusiasm of someone meeting a celebrity, even when we only went outside to get the mail. And yet, the strangest, most heartwarming truth is this: dogs chose us. They weren't forced, they weren't captured, they weren't bribed with luxury. Okay, maybe a little bribed. But from the moment that first lonely wolf sat near that first lonely fire, dogs stayed because something about humans, our warmth, our chaos, our scraps, our stubbornness, felt right to them. And humans battling ice, famine, empires, plague, heartbreak, and bad architecture found something in dogs they couldn't find anywhere else. Pure, uncomplicated friendship, not political, not philosophical, not strategic, just real. And so the greatest partnership in history wasn't written in stone tablets or royal decrees. It was written in footprints. One human, one dog, walking side by side across the centuries. From Ice Age fires to Renaissance palaces to your living room today, dogs never stopped being our companions. And we never stopped needing them. Before the Roman legions ever set foot in Gaul, before Julius Caesar sharpened his quill to complain about everyone who wasn't Roman, there existed a group of figures who commanded more influence than any chieftain or warrior. The Druids, the cloaked scholars of the forest, the guardians of secrets, the philosophers who somehow managed to be both terrifying and charismatic at the same time. In a world where status usually came from how loudly you could shout or how many enemies you could decapitate, Druids stood apart. Their power came not from violence, but from something Gauls regarded with even greater awe: knowledge. To the ordinary Gaul, a Druid wasn't merely a priest. He was the astronomer who charted the stars, the judge who settled tribal disputes, the political advisor who reminded kings not to be idiots, and the mystic who could read divine signs in the smoke of a ritual fire. If your tribe needed to bless an upcoming battle, negotiate peace, resolve a property dispute, or figure out why your pigs were suddenly refusing to eat, you went straight to a Druid. Not because they were friendly, many were famously stern, but because everyone agreed they were the closest thing to a direct line to the gods. Their authority was built on an education system that would make even modern PhD students weep. A Druid might study for up to 20 years, memorizing colossal amounts of legal codes, genealogies, cosmology, poetry, mythology, ritual procedures, and philosophical doctrine. And they memorized all of it without writing anything down. Not because they lacked writing, they knew Greek and Latin well enough, but because they considered sacred knowledge too important to risk being read by people who weren't ready. Also, it's an excellent way to ensure that only the truly dedicated join your order. Nothing filters out the half-hearted like being told, "Wonderful. Now memorize the entire spiritual history of your people by next winter." But perhaps the most intriguing part was their presence. A Druid didn't walk, he arrived. Wrapped in woolen robes, usually white for rituals, they carried an aura of seriousness that even the rowdiest warriors respected. Kings listened to them, entire tribes deferred to them, and when a Druid raised his hand to speak, the forest seemed to go quiet, as if the very land acknowledged their authority. They were scholars, mystics, scientists, judges, and philosophers, all wrapped in one enigmatic figure whose power flowed not from a throne, but from the depths of ancient memory. If Chapter 1 introduced the Druids as the quiet power behind Gaulish society, Chapter 2 reveals the training grounds that forged these forest philosophers, the sacred groves. These weren't your ordinary patches of trees. To the Celts, a grove wasn't just a location. It was a living classroom, a sanctuary where knowledge flowed as freely as the wind through oak leaves. And for aspiring Druids, it was where their minds were reshaped, reorganized, and occasionally broken by the sheer amount of information they were expected to memorize. Entering Druidic training was a commitment far more intense than joining a warrior band. Warriors trained to fight. Druids trained to understand everything. The stars, the laws, the gods, the seasons, medicinal herbs, moral philosophy, sacred geometry, and a terrifying amount of poetry. Their curriculum was equal parts academic, spiritual, and brutally practical. Students might spend years observing the sky to track seasonal cycles, studying the behavior of animals to interpret omens, or learning which plants cured ailments and which plants made you see glowing spirits dancing on riverbanks. But the core of their training, and the part Romans found most suspicious, was their absolute refusal to write any of this knowledge down. To the Druids, writing things down was like handing out cheat codes to the universe. Sacred knowledge needed to be earned, not skimmed. As a result, memory became their most powerful tool. A Druid in training had to memorize vast oral libraries, some lasting hours or even days when recited properly. If you forgot a section, you didn't get a gentle reminder. You started again from the beginning, often while standing in cold fog, because Gaulish weather does not care that you're trying to become a priest. Their teachers were strict but respected. Senior Druids were the custodians of cultural memory, and they enforced discipline not through punishment but through expectation. They saw themselves as guardians of civilization, and if you wanted to join them, you had better treat that responsibility with the seriousness it deserved. Yet their education wasn't just about storing information. It was about shaping a mind capable of interpreting the world. A Druid needed to read signs in nature, understand the cycles of the cosmos, make legal judgments, advise kings, and perform rituals. Their knowledge wasn't theoretical. It had weight, consequences, and meaning. By the end of their training, a successful student emerged not just as a scholar, but as a conduit between the human world and the realm of the divine, a role only a few were ever truly prepared to carry. To outsiders, the Druids looked like mysterious forest mystics. But to the Gauls themselves, Druids were something far more practical. They were the backbone of justice. Long before Roman law marched across Europe, wrapped in toga and bureaucracy, the Druids served as the judges and arbitrators of Celtic society. If someone stole cattle, broke an oath, insulted a clan, or accidentally set fire to their neighbor's hut, because open flames and thatched roofs are a terrible combination, it was the Druids who stepped in to decide the matter. Their authority as judges wasn't symbolic. It was absolute. When a Druid delivered a verdict, the tribe obeyed. Even kings had to swallow their pride and accept the decision, because defying a Druid wasn't merely illegal, it was unthinkable. The Druids carried the weight of tradition, divine authority, and centuries of precedent in their words. And unlike Roman courts, where some clever orator could twist laws like pretzels, Celtic justice relied on memory and consensus. A Druid didn't consult scrolls. He consulted centuries of oral tradition stored in his mind. Druidic law wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoring balance. Their rulings focused on compensation, reconciliation, and preventing needless blood feuds. In a world where personal honor mattered as much as survival, these judgments held communities together. A single feud between families could spiral into years of chaos, and the Druids acted as the brakes on that cultural catastrophe. They negotiated peace between clans, divided land, and resolved disputes in a way that preserved social harmony. They also oversaw oaths, treaties, and diplomatic agreements. When two tribes agreed to peace, a Druid witnessed the pact, invoking the gods as guarantors. Breaking a promise in the presence of a Druid was the ancient Gaulish equivalent of painting a massive target on your back, not because the Druid would punish you directly, but because the gods supposedly would. The Romans found this legal power unsettling. Caesar complained that Druids could even forbid people from participating in rituals or gatherings, effectively exiling them spiritually. In a society built on communal identity, this was the harshest punishment imaginable. A social death sentence delivered without raising a sword. Through their judgments, the Druids shaped everyday life in Gaul. They weren't simply wise old counselors. They were the living embodiment of law and order, holding the delicate fabric of tribal society together with memory, diplomacy, and a reputation so respected that even warriors feared disappointing them. If the Druids were the judges and philosophers of Gaul, they were also its ritual specialists, the ones who kept the spiritual machinery of the Celtic world running smoothly. To the Gauls, every river, hill, grove, and storm had a spirit. The universe was alive, and the Druids were the only ones who knew how to communicate with it properly. Their ritual responsibilities ranged from gentle seasonal blessings and healing ceremonies to the dramatic, interpreting omens in sacred fires, to the slightly terrifying, depending on which Roman author you believe. Central to Druidic ritual life was the sacred calendar. The Druids charted the turning of the seasons, the cycles of the moon, solstices, equinoxes, and the invisible rhythms that shaped agricultural and spiritual life. Festivals such as Samhain, Beltan, Lugnasad, and Imbolc weren't random celebrations. They were precise markers in a cosmic schedule. A festival performed too early or too late risked disturbing the harmony between the human world and the divine. So yes, if a druid showed up and told you the bonfire must be lit now, you lit it immediately. Their rituals involved offerings to the gods, often food, crafted objects, or animals, though the Romans famously accused druids of performing human sacrifices. Caesar described wicker effigies filled with victims and set ablaze, a scene dramatic enough to make any Roman reader gasp. Whether these accounts were accurate, exaggerated, or propaganda meant to justify conquest is still debated. But one thing is clear. The Druids were deeply connected to ritual acts meant to restore balance, heal dishonor, or ensure divine favor. What Rome saw as brutality may have been to the Gauls a sacred duty carried out in times of crisis. Druids also oversaw augury, reading signs from nature. The movement of birds, the crackle of fire, the shapes formed by smoke. All were messages from the gods. A druid trained for decades could interpret these signs like a cosmic language. Warriors wouldn't go to battle without their blessing. Farmers wouldn't plant without their timing. And even kings sought ritual confirmation before making major decisions. But what truly set druidic rituals apart was their setting. Rather than temples carved from stone, the Druids preferred natural sanctuaries. Oak groves, riversides, hilltops, places where the boundary between worlds felt unusually thin. Here, under ancient branches or open sky, they performed acts meant to maintain harmony between the mortal and the divine. In these groves, surrounded by the living world, the Druids became not just priests, but caretakers of cosmic balance, guiding Gaul through the unseen forces that shaped its destiny. While the Druids are often remembered as forest mystics, whispering secrets beneath ancient oaks, their minds were equally fixed on the sky above. To the Gauls, the cosmos wasn't an abstract concept. It was a living clock, a divine script written in constellations, cycles, and shadows. The Druids possessed the unique ability to decipher this intricate system. Far from being just simple-minded priests, they were actually highly accomplished astronomers, meticulously mapping the heavens with a precision that left even the Romans in awe. Long before the invention of telescopes or formal observatories, the Druids ingeniously utilized the natural world as their personal laboratory. Hilltops served as vantage points, stone circles acted as celestial markers, and rivers reflecting moonlight became tools for measuring the passage of time. Through patient and diligent observation, they acquired the knowledge to predict solstices, equinoxes, eclipses, and the subtle shifts in the seasons. Their understanding of lunar cycles was so refined that even Caesar, with a hint of reluctance, admitted that the Druids had mastered the complex calculations needed to maintain an accurate lunar-based calendar. This profound celestial knowledge wasn't merely an academic pursuit. It deeply influenced their daily lives. Agriculture depended on precise timing aligned with the stars. Rituals demanded accurate astronomical alignment for their ceremonies, and festivals had to coincide with specific cosmic windows to ensure their effectiveness. A druid might journey across vast territories simply to ensure that a sacred fire was lit at the precise moment the sun crossed a critical celestial threshold. And if that meant scaling a windswept hill at dawn, bundled in layers of wool against the cold, then so be it. Cosmic schedules, after all, are notoriously unforgiving. But perhaps the most compelling evidence of Druidic astronomy lies in the ancient monuments scattered throughout Celtic lands. Although some of these structures predated the Druids by thousands of years, the Druids inherited them and skillfully repurposed them as astronomical instruments. Stone circles, standing stones, and megalithic complexes often align with solstices or significant lunar events, suggesting that the Druids possessed a far deeper understanding of the relationship between the earth and the sky than most other ancient cultures. Within these stone landscapes, the Druids functioned as both astronomers and historians, preserving ancient wisdom and seamlessly integrating it into their teachings. Their fascination with the stars was not purely scientific. It was deeply philosophical. To the Druids, the universe was a harmonious, interconnected system where everything had its own rhythm, place, and purpose. Understanding the heavens was seen as a path to understanding the will of the divine. Their cosmology intricately connected human destiny with the celestial order, suggesting that the world operated according to knowable principles, which could be understood through careful observation and the pursuit of wisdom. Because of this profound understanding, Druidic astronomy carried immense authority within their society. If a Druid declared that the gods either favored or forbade a particular action based on cosmic readings, no warrior, king, or council dared to defy their pronouncements. Their mastery of the stars elevated them from mere priests to cosmic interpreters, individuals capable of bridging the gap between earthly existence and the vast, mysterious expanse above. If the Druids looked to the stars to understand the heavens, they also looked down to the earth, to the roots, the bark, the moss, and the water to understand the human body. In a world devoid of formal medical practitioners, where most medical treatments relied on either prayer or blind hope, the Druids represented the closest thing Gaul had to trained physicians. Their healing practices were far from random folk remedies. They constituted a sophisticated system meticulously woven together from careful observation, ritualistic practices, and generations of accumulated knowledge. Druidic healers were masters of herbal medicine. They possessed extensive knowledge of which plants could effectively numb pain, which could reduce fevers, which could heal wounds, and, perhaps more importantly, which you should absolutely avoid unless you were hoping to spend the next 6 hours hallucinating that the river was having a conversation with you. Their botanical wisdom was legendary throughout the land. They harvested mistletoe from sacred oaks using golden sickles, not simply for dramatic effect, but because they genuinely believed that it carried a potent form of divine vitality. They utilized willow bark, which is rich in salicin, the precursor to modern aspirin, long before the science of chemistry had even given it a proper name. But their healing practices extended far beyond the realm of herbs. The Druids also understood the critical importance of environment, diet, and ritual cleansing. They employed steam baths, river immersion, and even early forms of massage therapy. They treated not only the physical wound but also the spiritual imbalance that they believed had caused it in the first place. To a Gaul, illness was not merely a biological phenomenon. It represented a disruption in the delicate harmony between the body, the spirit, and the world of the gods. The Druids' role was to restore that essential balance. Their reputation also encompassed more mysterious practices. They interpreted dreams, meticulously analyzed physical signs, and employed chants believed to activate the healing properties of specific herbs. While modern medicine might scoff at the idea of singing to a poultice, the Gauls firmly believed that the spoken word carried significant power, and the Druids were undoubtedly the most skilled wielders of sacred speech. Knowledge of poisons was also part of their repertoire. Druids possessed a deep understanding of both toxic and medicinal plants, which made them invaluable in identifying potential dangers and, if necessary, in crafting potent substances for warfare or ritualistic purposes. This, unsurprisingly, made the Romans deeply suspicious of them. To Caesar, a priest who could cure a fever one day and concoct a lethal poison the next was essentially a political threat, cleverly disguised in robes and wielding botanical expertise. Yet, at their core, Druidic healers were primarily caregivers. People sought them out in moments of profound vulnerability, during childbirth, in the wake of injuries, when battling fever, or when struggling with emotional turmoil. Their role extended beyond simply stitching wounds or curing sickness. It encompassed reassuring, guiding, and skillfully reweaving the invisible threads that connected individuals to the greater cosmic order. In this capacity, Druids stood not only as guardians of the mind and spirit, but also as protectors of the fragile human body, bridging the realms of earth, plant, and soul in the delicate art of healing. While warriors roared on the battlefield and kings boasted of their lineage, the true political nerve center of ancient Gaul often resided quietly in the hands of the Druids. They did not wear crowns or command armies, yet their influence subtly shaped decisions at every level of society. Where others wielded spears, the Druids wielded counsel, and in many ways that proved to be the more deadly weapon. Kings might rule tribes, but Druids ruled hearts, minds, and the very fabric of legitimacy. In a world characterized by shifting alliances and constant intertribal rivalries, the Druids served as the diplomatic glue that held everything together. When two clans became embroiled in a feud that stretched back generations, perhaps triggered by cattle theft, a deeply felt insult, or someone's unfortunate choice of words, it was invariably the Druids who stepped in to negotiate a lasting peace. Their authority transcended tribal boundaries, allowing a Druid from one region to effectively mediate disputes hundreds of miles away, simply because their reputation traveled farther than any warrior's spear could reach. Kings trusted them, or perhaps a more accurate way to put it would be, kings depended on them. Political decisions required divine approval, and the Druids served as the primary interpreters of the divine will. Before declaring war, forging alliances, or launching major expeditions, rulers invariably consulted their Druids. A wise king listened attentively to their counsel, while a foolish king disregarded it, usually to his own regret. If a Druid declared that the omens were unfavorable, even the most eager warrior would reluctantly sheath his sword and wait for a more auspicious time. But Druidic influence extended far beyond the realm of diplomacy. They also served as keepers of the national memory, meticulously preserving genealogies and histories, ensuring that rulers could trace their lineage back to heroic ancestors. Without Druidic validation, a king's claim to authority could easily crumble. It was one thing to boast about one's ancestry. It was quite another to have the intellectual elite publicly confirm your lineage in front of an entire tribe. This unsurprisingly terrified the Romans. Caesar realized that while he could defeat Gaulish warriors through military force, he could not fully conquer the population as long as the Druids remained politically active. They unified disparate tribes, stirred resistance against Roman rule, and embodied the very spiritual backbone of the land. Eliminating Druidic influence, therefore, became as crucial as defeating any Gaulish chieftain on the battlefield. Yet, despite their immense power, Druids rarely sought personal glory. They did not strive to rule, but rather to guide. Their authority stemmed not from their position but from their wisdom, their encyclopedic memory, and the unwavering trust of the people. They were the steady presence behind the shifting political landscapes, the quiet shadow behind every throne, ensuring that rulers governed not through impulsive whims, but through cosmic order and the wisdom of ancestral law. In this role, the Druids shaped Gaul not with swords but with wisdom, thereby wielding a power far deeper and more enduring than any battlefield victory could ever provide. By the time Rome's eagle standards appeared on the horizon, the Druids were already deeply entrenched as the intellectual and spiritual core of Gaulish society. To Julius Caesar, this was not merely an inconvenience. It was a significant danger. Conquering a land physically was one thing, but conquering the minds and beliefs of its people was an entirely different and far more challenging task. And the Druids were precisely the kind of leaders who could inspire a population to resist the encroaching empire. They possessed no swords, no armies, and no fortresses, but they held immense influence, unquestioned authority, and a widespread network of loyal students scattered throughout the various tribes. To Rome, that combination proved to be far more threatening than any individual warrior. Caesar's own writings, which, let's be honest, are about as neutral as a politician's autobiography, paint a dramatic picture of the Druids actively stirring resistance against Roman rule. He describes them as organizers of rebellion, custodians of anti-Roman sentiment, and the spiritual engineers behind uprisings like those led by Vercingetorix. Although Caesar conveniently blamed them for virtually everything that went wrong, the truth was far simpler. The Druids represented a distinct cultural identity that Rome could simply not absorb into its imperial system. Where Rome brought laws, taxes, and infrastructure, the Druids embodied memory, tradition, and a worldview that was fundamentally incompatible with Roman imperial control. The Romans understood that defeating warriors only won battles, but defeating the Druids would ultimately win them Gaul. As the conquest unfolded, Druids became prime targets for Roman aggression. Sacred groves were systematically cut down, ritual sites were desecrated, and Druidic assemblies were officially banned. Rome hoped that by destroying the physical locations where Druids performed their rituals, they could sever the spiritual roots of Gaulish identity. Yet, despite these efforts, the Druids persisted. They did not simply vanish from the landscape. Instead, they adapted to the changing circumstances. Some retreated deeper into the forests, continuing their teachings in secrecy, far from the prying eyes of the Roman authorities. Others traveled to regions still free from Roman rule, such as Britain and Ireland, where they strengthened existing resistance networks. The island sanctuary of Anglesey became a last stronghold, a place where Druids gathered in significant numbers to preserve their traditions. When the Roman general Suetonius Paulinus arrived in 60 CE to crush this final bastion of Druidic power, he encountered something chilling, even for his hardened soldiers. Druids lined the shore, chanting curses, while women in black garments screamed prophecies, with fires burning behind them, creating the unsettling backdrop of an apocalyptic scene. Even the disciplined Roman soldiers hesitated in the face of this spectacle. But eventually, Rome attacked, slaughtering Druids and torching the sacred groves. This moment marked the symbolic destruction of organized Druidic power in Gaul. But even then, Rome could not completely erase the memory of the Druids. Their teachings continued underground, woven into folklore and oral tradition, passed down through generations in hushed whispers. Conquered they may have been, but extinguished they were not. The war for the soul of Gaul did not end with swords. It simply moved into the realm of memory. When Rome finally tightened its grip on Gaul, and the last sacred groves fell silent beneath the axes of Roman legionaries, many assumed that the Druids would simply fade into the footnotes of history, just another conquered priesthood absorbed into the vast Roman Empire. But the Druids refused to disappear completely. Their legacy, persistent and remarkably subtle, flowed through the centuries like an underground river, resurfacing in unexpected places and shaping cultural memory long after their physical presence had been erased from the landscape. The most enduring part of their legacy lies in the lands that Rome never fully conquered, Ireland and parts of Britain. Their Druidic traditions survived, gradually evolving into the early Celtic Christian monastic systems. Many of the monks who later illuminated manuscripts, meticulously preserved ancient law, and built monastic schools, inherited intellectual habits that bore a striking resemblance to those of the Druids. A strong emphasis on memorization, a preference for oral teaching, a deep reverence for nature, and a commitment to scholarship rooted in observation rather than rigid dogma. Even the very idea of sacred knowledge being carefully guarded and passed down through long apprenticeships echoed ancient Druidic methods. Folklore, too, played a crucial role in keeping the memory of the Druids alive. Generations of storytellers whispered tales of wise men in white robes, of healers who could speak with rivers, and of judges whose words carried divine weight. The stories, of course, changed over time, with medieval writers transforming them into wizards, Renaissance thinkers romanticizing them as natural philosophers, and modern pop culture portraying them as staff-wielding magicians with suspiciously well-maintained hair. But beneath every retelling of their story lies a genuine cultural memory, the enduring respect and mystery that surrounded the ancient Gaulish Druids. Their reverence for nature also survived in countless cultural practices. The very idea of sacred groves subtly influenced the selection of early Christian holy sites, with many churches being deliberately built near ancient ritual trees or springs, as if acknowledging that the land itself still held a sacred memory. Even today, Celtic festivals like Samhain and Beltane, although reshaped over time by different cultural influences, still trace their roots back to the ancient calendars that the Druids helped to maintain. Their intellectual legacy is equally profound. The Druids believed that the universe was a harmonious, interconnected system, a philosophy that bears a remarkable resemblance to modern ecological thought. They saw humanity as an integral part of the natural world, not as something separate from or superior to it. This worldview, once dismissed as primitive, now feels uncannily ahead of its time. And perhaps most importantly, the Druids remain powerful symbols of wisdom, resistance, and cultural identity. They embody the enduring idea that knowledge can be a form of power that is far more enduring than swords or empires. Rome may have conquered Gaul, but the Druids persist in memory, in myth, and in the collective cultural consciousness. Their groves may have fallen, but their echoes still linger in stories, in traditions, and in the ancient sense that wisdom is something that is grown, carefully guarded, and passed on under the whispering branches of time. Harald Hardrada did not make his entrance into history quietly. At the remarkably young age of just 15, an age when most boys are still struggling to coordinate their limbs, Harald found himself standing amidst the chaos of a battlefield that would irrevocably alter the course of his entire life. The Battle of Stiklestad was a scene of pure pandemonium. Steel flashing in the Nordic sun, shields splintering under relentless blows, and war cries echoing fiercely through the valley. And at the bloody epicenter of this carnage, Harald witnessed his half-brother, King Olaf the Stout of Norway, fall beneath a storm of enemy blades. With the king dead and the rebellion decisively crushed, Harald suddenly realized that he was now unequivocally on the losing side of absolutely everything. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the young warrior made the only sensible decision he could. He ran. Not because he lacked courage, but because even the bravest of men understand that facing an angry mob of victorious Norwegian farmers armed with nothing but youthful optimism is generally a poor strategic move. Gathering a handful of loyal companions, Harald slipped away into the dense forests, then headed east across the rugged mountains, leaving behind a kingdom that he could no longer call home. But exile did not break him. If anything, it seemed to sharpen his resolve. He eventually reached the court of Prince Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev, where the tall and intensely focused Norwegian quickly distinguished himself. Yaroslav immediately recognized the potential in the towering teenager, who carried himself with the poise and confidence of a man twice his age. And for Harald, this was just the beginning of his adventures. He spent months forging new alliances, rigorously training with the hardened warriors of the Kievan Rus, and carefully nurturing the embers of ambition that burned within him. Yet Harald's gaze was fixed even farther eastward, toward the shimmering jewel of the medieval world. Constantinople, the legendary city of emperors, untold riches, dangerous secrets, and ever-present peril. To the Norsemen, it was known as Miklagard, the great city, a place where fortunes could be made beyond one's wildest dreams or lives could be lost in the blink of an eye. And Harald, still barely out of boyhood, decided that Constantinople was where he truly belonged. When he finally arrived, towering over most Byzantines by a full head, the guards at the city gates must have wondered which Norse saga had inadvertently wandered into their shift. The Byzantines would soon learn his name, however. He would join the elite Varangian Guard, rise through its ranks with astonishing speed, and build a reputation so formidable that whispers of his exploits would eventually travel back to the fjords that he had fled. He had left Norway as an exile, but in Byzantium, Harald Hardrada would begin his remarkable transformation from a runaway prince into a living legend. By the time Harald finally stood before the towering gates of Constantinople, he had crossed more rivers, traversed more forests, and navigated more hostile territories than most people do in an entire lifetime. But nothing, not even the glittering courts of Kiev, could have fully prepared him for the sheer spectacle of Miklagard. Its imposing marble walls rose like sheer cliffs, its bustling markets buzzed with a cacophony of 1,000 different languages, and its opulent palaces gleamed with gold, intricate mosaics, and enough luxury to make even the most jaded Viking rub his eyes in disbelief. To Harald, who had grown up in a simple wooden hall surrounded by goats and snow, this city was like stepping onto another planet. And yet, he did not shrink back in awe. He walked through Constantinople as though he were returning home from a long and arduous journey, rather than entering the greatest empire on earth. His sheer height alone drew stares from passers-by, with Norse sagas insisting that Harald was so tall that most Byzantine soldiers looked like children standing beside him. Whether this was historical truth or simply heroic exaggeration hardly mattered. The Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite corps of Scandinavian warriors, noticed him almost immediately. Joining the Varangians was not a simple matter. It was not a place for common drifters or drunken adventurers hoping for an easy paycheck. This was a regiment built on unwavering loyalty, strict discipline, and an unspoken oath to protect the emperor at all costs. The Byzantines placed their trust in the Norsemen because they were foreigners, which meant that they had no local political loyalties to exploit. They were warriors specifically hired for their unparalleled strength and their stubborn resistance to bribery. If you wanted an honest sword in that treacherous world, you hired a Varangian. Harald approached their commanders not with a humble petition for service, but with something akin to a resume filled with hard-won experience. He had survived a lost war, fought alongside seasoned Rus warriors, and carried himself with the unmistakable air of someone destined for command. The Varangians accepted him into their ranks, and so Harald Sigurdsson, the runaway prince of Norway, became a member of the emperor's personal guard. Training began immediately. The Varangians drilled in complex battle formations, learned Byzantine military etiquette, and studied tactical maneuvers that would have seemed almost magical to Norse warriors accustomed to the more direct approach of brute force combat. Harald adapted quickly to this new environment. His discipline impressed the officers, and his sheer physical presence made him a natural in the shield line. To the Byzantines, he was exactly the sort of man you wanted standing in the palace corridor when someone whispered the ominous words, "Assassination plot." But Harald was more than just muscle. He was also keenly intelligent. He studied languages, delved into the intricacies of court politics, and absorbed Byzantine military strategy like a sponge. He observed the empire carefully, learning its secrets and understanding its ambitions. He had come seeking fortune, but he soon found something far more potent: a clear path to power, a stage worthy of his ambition, and a forge that would transform a wandering exile into the thunderbolt of Byzantium. Life in the Varangian Guard was nothing like Harald's past as a Norwegian prince or a wandering exile. The Guard was an institution built on iron discipline, relentless training, and absolute loyalty to one man, the Byzantine emperor. For Harald, this was a world of shining armor, marble halls, and complex politics, a stark contrast to the wooden halls and more direct, sword-to-the-face diplomacy of the North. Yet he adapted to this new environment with astonishing ease, almost as if he had been waiting his entire life for a setting that was truly worthy of his ambition. New Varangians quickly learned the rules of survival. Speak little, observe everything, and never, ever betray the emperor. Their duties included guarding the palace gates, patrolling long corridors lined with shimmering gold mosaics, and standing silent vigil during imperial ceremonies that seemed to last longer than some Viking winters. And though it might sound primarily ceremonial, danger lurked everywhere in the shadows of the palace. Byzantine court politics made even the bloodiest northern feuds look like children arguing over toys. Plots simmered constantly beneath the surface, and the threat of assassination was as commonplace as morning prayers. This treacherous environment sharpened Harald's already keen senses. He learned to read subtle gestures, sense the undercurrents of tension in a crowded room, and recognize the telltale signs of treachery. His intelligence impressed his senior officers, and his imposing height made him an almost mythical presence in the emperor's entourage. When Harald stood silently behind the throne, axe in hand, everyone understood the clear message. Loyalty had a very large and very sharp guardian. The Varangians also drilled endlessly, practicing complex formation combat, honing shield wall tactics specifically adapted for palace defense, and rehearsing emergency evacuation procedures for the emperor himself. For Harald, who had grown up in a culture that glorified individual valor, Byzantine discipline was a revelation. Here, he learned about grand strategy, the importance of precise coordination, and the fine art of staying alive in what was arguably the deadliest political battleground in all of Europe. His unwavering determination did not go unnoticed by those in power. Emperor Michael for himself reportedly took a personal interest in the tall northern warrior. Harold's exceptional skill, unwavering focus, and silent professionalism made him stand out even in a corps that was already filled with elite fighters. If the emperor walked at night, Harold might be among the guards at his side. If a ceremony required absolute security, Harold might be stationed closest to the imperial dais. Bit by bit, he earned a place in the empire's inner protective circle. For a young man who had lost his homeland, this was more than just a great honor. It was also validation, a clear sign that he could rise again, rebuild his shattered future, and forge a name for himself that would be even greater than anything Norway might have offered him. The exile was no more. The ascent of Harald Hardrada had officially begun. Serving in the Varangian Guard was not simply a matter of lounging in palace corridors all day, meticulously polishing axes, and looking intimidating, although Harold certainly excelled at that part of the job, too. Byzantium was an empire that was constantly under pressure, facing threats from all sides. Rebellions flared up like uncontrollable brush fires across its vast provinces, with Bulgarian uprisings, Sicilian revolts, Anatolian conspiracies, and the endless turbulence of its eastern borders. And when things grew dangerous enough that ordinary Byzantine troops hesitated to act, imperial commanders invariably summoned the Varangians. They were the emperor's personal fire brigade, sent to extinguish trouble with cold steel and unwavering Norse determination. Harold, still young but driven by an intense need to prove himself, threw his entire being into these campaigns. The sagas describe him fighting in Bulgaria, Sicily, Asia Minor, and even as far away as the Holy Land. Wherever a rebellion surged, Harold appeared like an axe-wielding omen of destruction. His preferred tactics, according to later Norse tradition, involved hitting enemies so hard and so fast that they questioned their very life choices before they even had a chance to hit the ground. The Byzantines quickly learned that if you wanted a problem solved both efficiently and permanently, you sent the tall Norseman with the intense eyes and the unervingly calm expression. One of his most famous campaigns was in Bulgaria, where the rebellion was so fierce that Byzantine soldiers had begun calling the uprising the War of the Mountains. The terrain was brutal, characterized by dense forests, treacherous rocky passes, and the constant threat of ambushes at every turn. But Harold thrived in conditions that others feared. The Varangians pressed relentlessly into rebel strongholds, carving their way through difficult terrain with a stubbornness that only a Norse warrior could truly maintain. The sagas claim that Harold was always the first to storm the walls of enemy fortifications, the last to retreat in the face of overwhelming odds, and occasionally the one who suggested strategies so bold and unconventional that they made even seasoned Byzantine officers blink twice in surprise. His reputation grew exponentially with every successful campaign. Rebels whispered fearful tales about the Northman giant, while Byzantine commanders began relying on him not just as a source of brute force, but also as a dependable problem solver. Emperor Michael IV reportedly rewarded him personally for his pivotal role in crushing these uprisings, bestowing upon him not only gold and elevated rank, but also a deep sense of trust. But it wasn't only his battlefield ferocity that earned Harold such widespread respect. It was also his unwavering discipline. Even when fighting far from the capital, he remained unflinchingly loyal to the emperor, a rare trait in a world where many mercenaries bent with the prevailing political winds. Every rebellion he crushed and every fortress he helped to take elevated him higher in the eyes of the empire. Harold was no longer merely a guard. He was becoming Byzantium's thunderbolt, the warrior that the empire unleashed when failure was simply not an option. And with each hard-fought victory, the legend of Harald Hardrada burned ever brighter. By the time the rebellions had been stamped out and the empire's borders had been momentarily quieted, Harald Hardrada was no longer just another Varangian with a heavy axe and a remarkable talent for surviving impossible situations. He had become something far rarer, a warrior that the emperor himself deeply trusted. Emperor Michael IV, a man who was constantly surrounded by intrigue, sycophants, and enemies cleverly disguised as friends, had a dire need for absolute loyalty, and he found it in the towering Norwegian exile who never flinched, never hesitated, and never bent to pressure. Harald's promotion into the emperor's personal bodyguard marked a new chapter in his life. The imperial palace, with its seemingly endless marble corridors, its glittering jeweled icons, and its oppressively tense political atmosphere, became his new battleground. He quickly learned the intricate rhythm of imperial life, the early morning audiences, the ceaseless stream of petitions, and the hushed whispers exchanged behind ornate veils and drawn curtains. In this environment, a single misplaced step or a poorly chosen word could prove to be far deadlier than any sword stroke. Harald became a silent sentinel, watching everything with the unwavering focus of a wolf guarding its den. The sagas claim that he stood at Michael's side during elaborate ceremonies, lavish banquets, and highly sensitive private meetings. Whenever the emperor traveled, whether it was by ceremonial procession or through a secret nighttime movement, Harald was always a part of the protective Varangian wall that shielded him from any potential danger. His mere presence served as a powerful deterrent, and even the most ambitious conspirator would think twice before acting rashly with Harald standing nearby. Before testing a guard who looked as though he could break a man simply by leaning on him too hard. But guarding the emperor was not just about standing still, looking intimidating, though Harald certainly excelled at that. The Varangians were the final line of defense against plots. They vetted rooms before the emperor entered them, monitored courtiers for suspicious behavior, and intervened quietly when threats arose. Harald learned names, faces, allegiances. He developed an instinct for danger, spotting subtle signs, a glance too sharp, a hand too quick that others missed. In a realm where poison was more common than open battle, vigilance was his greatest weapon. Michael IV, whose health often fluctuated, relied heavily on the stability and loyalty of his northern guardsmen. Some Byzantine chroniclers even hint that Harald's honesty was refreshing for an emperor drowning in court politics. The Norsemen had no ties to Byzantine noble families, no interest in palace intrigue, and no agenda beyond fulfilling his oath. For Harald, this was more than military service. It was an education in power, true power. He watched emperors command legions with a word, manage rebellions with a gesture, and hold entire provinces in the palm of their hand. One day he would attempt the same. But here in Constantinople, Harald was still sharpening the edge of a destiny that would one day shake kingdoms. The emperor had gained a guardian, and Harald had gained a blueprint for kingship. Few places in the medieval world held the same mystique as the treasure vaults beneath the Hagia Sophia. This wasn't just any storeroom. It was the financial heart of the empire. Imagine a labyrinth of locked chambers brimming with gold seals, ceremonial crowns glittering with jewels, the imperial regalia, sacred relics, and diplomatic gifts sent from distant kings. It held more coin than most kingdoms would see in an entire century. Guarding such a place demanded more than mere brute strength. It required unwavering discipline, keen intelligence, and absolute honesty. So, naturally, the Byzantines entrusted this critical task to the Varangians. And, of course, the Varangian they trusted above all others was Harald Hardrada. Harald's role as a vault guardian was a testament to his rising reputation within the Varangian Guard. The empire didn't assign such vital responsibilities to just any warrior who was skilled with an axe. They entrusted them to men impervious to corruption. Harald, with his stern Nordic sense of honor and his intimidating stare, perfectly fit that description. The sagas recount that he supervised the movement of treasure during imperial ceremonies, meticulously oversaw its inventory, and ensured that nothing, not even a single gold coin, disappeared into the wrong hands. This was undoubtedly dangerous work. Treasure was a constant temptation, and temptation fueled conspiracies. Courtiers schemed endlessly, dreaming of acquiring power, influence, or even seizing the throne. A missing artifact could trigger a royal investigation, and a vanished chest of coins could lead to the downfall of an entire noble house. Harald stood at the center of this web of intrigue with quiet confidence, as impartial as stone. His duty extended beyond simply guarding wealth. He was protecting the very stability of the empire. But there was another layer to this assignment: prestige. Only the most elite Varangians were granted access to the treasure vaults, and those who served there often amassed considerable wealth themselves, rewarded with generous bonuses, valuable spoils, and a share of imperial gifts. Harold, already burning with ambition, seized this opportunity. Service in the vaults granted him access to riches he could never have imagined back in his homeland. By the time he departed Byzantium years later, he possessed enough gold to buy alliances, hire formidable armies, and reclaim the throne he had lost as a teenager. The sagas even whisper that he sometimes guarded relics brought from Jerusalem, treasures seized from rebellions, and diplomatic gifts from faraway lands like Egypt and Persia. Standing in the flickering torchlight, surrounded by centuries of accumulated brilliance, Harold observed firsthand how empires measured power, not just through their armies, but through their vast treasures. Every chest he protected, every artifact he oversaw, deepened his understanding of wealth as a critical tool of rule. Constantinople was transforming him, molding the fierce warrior into a shrewd leader. In the vaults beneath the Hagia Sophia, Harold wasn't just guarding gold. He was learning how kings are made. If Harold Hardrada had only guarded emperors and treasure vaults, his legend would have been impressive enough. But it was in Sicily, that sun-drenched crossroads of the Mediterranean, that he truly earned the title bestowed upon him by the Norse sagas, the Thunderbolt of Byzantium. The island was a powder keg of revolt, fueled by ambition and cultural rivalries. Greeks, Arabs, Lombards, and Norman adventurers all vied for influence. When a major rebellion erupted and local Byzantine forces began to falter, the empire knew exactly who to dispatch. The Varangians, and among them Harold, who was already becoming infamous among rebels for appearing on battlefields with the sudden, devastating force of an unstoppable storm. The campaign in Sicily was brutal. Rebel fortresses were perched atop sheer cliffs, hidden within deep canyons, and defended by intricate city walls. Siege warfare in the intense Mediterranean heat tested even the most seasoned veterans. But Harold thrived in this environment. While other soldiers wilted under the scorching sun, the tall Norwegian moved with a calm, relentless certainty that unnerved his enemies. He possessed a rare combination of incredible endurance, unwavering discipline, and sheer, stubborn willpower. A blend of qualities that made him seem almost otherworldly to the rebels who faced him. One saga claims he devised a daring plan to set fire to ships within a heavily fortified harbor, effectively cutting off the rebels' crucial supply lines. Another recounts how he scaled a treacherous cliffside under the cover of darkness to open the gates of a besieged town. Byzantine sources, while less prone to dramatic embellishment, confirm that he was instrumental in capturing several key strongholds. Whether every story is literally true or embellished over time, the underlying pattern remains consistent. Whenever a fortress fell, Harold's name was invariably mentioned. He impressed not only his commanders but also the rank-and-file soldiers who fought alongside him. Despite his ambition, Harold was no aloof aristocrat. He fought in the shield wall, carried his own gear, and shared in the hardships of the grueling campaign. To the Byzantines, this display of humility, combined with his terrifying combat prowess, made him a warrior worthy of the utmost respect. To his fellow Varangians, it marked him as a true leader. Victories in Sicily strengthened the empire's grip on the island and filled its coffers with valuable spoils. And Harold, ever the strategist, took his fair share. These campaigns weren't just military achievements. They were calculated investments in the future he was quietly planning. By the end of the Sicilian War, Harold was no longer just a promising young guardsman. He had become a de facto battlefield commander, a man whose mere presence could turn the tide of war. The rebels, in hushed whispers, began to call him the North Wind, because he swept down upon them from nowhere, leaving only destruction in his wake. But for Byzantium, he was something even more valuable. A thunderbolt they could unleash whenever the world seemed to be ablaze. After Sicily, Harold had cemented his reputation as a Varangian who did not break, did not bend, and, judging by how rebellions crumbled around him, apparently did not tire. So, when the Byzantine Empire turned its attention eastward to the perpetually turbulent Holy Lands and the wealthy Syrian cities threatened by upheaval, it was only natural that Harold was dispatched with the elite contingents. These campaigns are less extensively documented in Byzantine chronicles, but they are celebrated with vivid detail in the Norse sagas, which claim that Harold traveled as far as Jerusalem and fought under the scorching sun of the Levant. Whether every detail is literally accurate or beautifully exaggerated for dramatic effect, one thing remains certain. Harold served in the East, and he distinguished himself once again. The conditions he encountered were a world apart from the misty forests of Norway or the opulent marble corridors of Constantinople. Heat shimmered relentlessly across vast desert plains. Sandstorms swept over encampments and enemy forces with blinding fury. Arab warriors, hardened by generations of near-constant conflict, fought with tactics entirely unfamiliar to the northern soldiers. But Harold adapted with remarkable speed. He learned how to march longer with less water, how to fight effectively in the looser formations best suited to the open desert terrain, and how to maintain discipline in clashes where the unforgiving landscape was often more dangerous than the enemy itself. The sagas portray him as a kind of pilgrim warrior, stating that he visited Jerusalem and played a role in securing routes for Christian pilgrims. Some accounts claim he fought off bandits near the Jordan River or guarded caravans carrying imperial treasures to holy shrines. Byzantine historians note that Varangians participated in suppressing revolts in Antioch and in helping to reassert control over critical eastern provinces, campaigns in which Harold almost certainly took part. One captivating story claims that he played a pivotal role in capturing a seemingly impenetrable fortress by secretly tunneling beneath its walls, collapsing its defenses in one calculated and devastating strike. Another suggests that he skillfully negotiated terms with local leaders after demonstrating such overwhelming force that they wisely decided diplomacy was a far healthier option than continued resistance. As always, the sagas tend to exaggerate for effect, but they don't invent reputations out of thin air. Harold earned his through grit, determination, and undeniable skill. These campaigns brought him far more than mere military victories. They provided him with invaluable experience in political finesse, introduced him to the immense wealth of Eastern markets, and exposed him to a diverse array of fighting styles, vastly broadening his understanding of warfare. To Harold, every battle, every grueling march, every tense negotiation was a crucial lesson, one he would later apply with ruthless effectiveness when claiming a throne of his own. By the end of his Eastern expeditions, Harold had become something truly remarkable. A warrior who could fight with the ferocity of a Viking, strategize with the cunning of a Byzantine, negotiate with the shrewdness of a Russ merchant, and endure with the unwavering resolve of a man carved from iron. He was, in essence, a perfect storm, meticulously preparing himself for his ultimate destiny. By the time Harold Hardrada reached the end of his service in the Varangian Guard, he was no longer the callow teenage exile who had first stumbled into Constantinople seeking purpose. He had been forged into something far greater. A commander in all but name, a collector of immense fortunes, a veteran of countless rebellions, sieges, desert marches, sea campaigns, and treacherous palace intrigues. He was now a man who had guarded emperors, crushed uprisings, marched across continents, and earned nicknames whispered in both fear and admiration. The Thunderbolt of Byzantium. And yet, despite all that he had accomplished, Harold harbored one unshakable conviction. The empire was not his true home. He had come to Byzantium to forge a future for himself, not to remain a permanent servant of emperors. His ambition pointed relentlessly northward, toward the cold fjords of Norway, where old wounds and unfinished business still relentlessly called his name. But leaving Byzantium was not as simple as packing his armor and walking out of the city gates. The empire did not readily relinquish valuable assets, especially one as formidable as Harold. Court factions were once again shifting, and the recent death of Emperor Michael IV had unleashed new political currents that threatened to entangle the Varangian star in dangerous and unpredictable intrigues. Some versions of the sagas claim that Harold ran afoul of Empress Zoe's court, perhaps over disputes involving treasure or even whispers of romantic entanglements. Byzantine sources remain conspicuously silent on this matter, but the underlying tension feels undeniably plausible. Harold had witnessed enough to know when the political winds were shifting, and he knew it was time to act decisively. Moreover, Harold still had something of immense importance to collect: his hard-earned wealth. Years of relentless campaigns had earned him a vast fortune in gold, silver, and priceless gifts. Enough to make him not just wealthy, but genuinely powerful. Enough, in fact, to return home not as a wandering exile, but as a formidable contender for the Norwegian throne. Gathering his riches silently and efficiently, Harald prepared his dramatic exit. The sagas describe his departure as something of a daring escape. Harald and his loyal men slipping out of the empire by ship, laden with treasure that the Byzantines might have preferred to keep locked securely within their vaults. Whether it was outright theft, unpaid wages, or simply dramatic exaggeration, one thing remains undeniably clear. Harald departed with more wealth than any Norseman of his generation. When his ships finally sailed northward, cutting through the dark waters of the Black Sea and then up the winding rivers of the Rus, Harald was no longer merely Harald Sigurdsson. He was a seasoned commander, a wealthy warlord, a warrior irrevocably shaped by the greatest empire on earth. He was now a man ready to challenge kings. And soon, he would seize the throne of Norway and carve his final, bloody chapter into the annals of history at Stamford Bridge. The Varangian years were over. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, was poised to rise. When Crusaders left Europe, they carried three things: a sword, a cross, and a vow of chastity that church officials insisted would keep them pure in purpose. It sounded noble during the blessing ceremonies, with incense drifting through stone cathedrals and choirs singing about holy duty. But the moment these knights reached the eastern Mediterranean, a land of warm nights, new cultures, and temptations they had never imagined, reality collided violently with theory. Most crusaders were young men, some barely out of adolescence, who had marched thousands of miles through Italy, across Anatolian deserts, and into cities that felt more like stories from exotic tales than real places. Antioch, Jerusalem, Acre. These were bustling crossroads where Latin, Greek, Arab, Armenian, and Syrian cultures mixed. Markets overflowed with perfumes, silk, spices, jewelry, and people whose lives did not resemble anything the Crusaders had known in Europe. Loneliness was a powerful thing. Most knights had left wives behind or had never married at all. Some came from rough rural villages where the most exotic sight was a traveling peddler. So when they suddenly found themselves surrounded by Eastern women wearing flowing linen, speaking unfamiliar languages, and carrying themselves with urban sophistication, it was only a matter of time before vows blurred, cracked, and quietly snapped, and the church's expectations were uncompromising. Crusader clerics preached constantly about chastity, warning knights that engaging with local women was not just sinful, it was strategically dangerous. They claimed the devil worked through desire, and that a knight distracted by romance was a knight weakened in spirit. But soldiers living in cramped tents, marching in blistering heat, and risking death almost daily, tended not to think like theologians. They thought like humans, tired, lonely, and starved for comfort. Behind the rigid official rules grew an unofficial reality. Crusaders began forming private arrangements with local women, sometimes tender, sometimes purely practical. Some knights kept concubines who cooked, cleaned, and offered companionship. Others entered secret marriages without the church's blessing. And some relationships bloomed from genuine affection, crossing cultural divides in ways that scandalized Latin clerics but fascinated later chroniclers. What emerged was a double life. The public facade of holy warriors sworn to purity, and the hidden world of intimacy and scandal simmering in back rooms, gardens, and the quiet corners of Levantine cities. The crusade may have been about reclaiming holy territory, but for many knights, it also became an unexpected journey into the complexities of desire, a battlefield of hearts no less dangerous than any siege. When crusaders arrived in the Levant, they discovered a world where cultures overlapped like woven carpets. Armenian merchants, Greek artisans, Arab poets, Syrian nobles, Jewish scholars, and countless others had lived side by side for centuries. Into this intricate tapestry marched the Western knights, armored, sunburned, linguistically clueless, and absolutely unprepared for what awaited them, especially the women. To the Crusaders, Eastern women were unlike anything in Europe. They carried themselves with a quiet confidence shaped by ancient cities and complex civilizations. They wore light linen garments suited to the heat, adorned with jewelry far more delicate than anything found in France or England. Their manners were refined. Their speech flowed with poetic cadence. Even the languages, Arabic, Armenian, Greek, Syriac, sounded to Crusader ears like music wrapped in mystery. And while medieval Europe insisted women remain veiled in modest submission, the Levant offered something different. Women in cities like Antioch and Jerusalem were legally empowered, economically active, and socially visible. They managed businesses, negotiated contracts, inherited property, and in some communities they held more rights than many women in Latin Europe could imagine. For Crusaders raised in rigid feudal norms, this was equal parts fascinating and disorienting. Interactions began awkwardly at first. Knights who expected quiet obedience were often confronted with women who spoke their minds, haggled fiercely in markets, and treated Western warriors with a blend of curiosity and skepticism. Yet curiosity cut both ways. Eastern women, accustomed to merchants, scholars, and local soldiers, suddenly found their streets filled with towering blonde-haired warriors from lands they had only heard about in rumors. The Crusaders' appearance, heavy armor, long swords, languages that sounded like growled thunderstorms, made them seem exotic, dangerous, and occasionally amusing. Cultural barriers didn't stop relationships. They simply made them more complicated. Latin knights often didn't share a language with the women they pursued, so gestures, gifts, and badly pronounced phrases became the tools of courtship. Some relied on interpreters, others relied on charm, or whatever passed for charm among men who spent most of their lives in armor. And yet, despite everything, connections formed. Sometimes through genuine affection, sometimes through necessity, sometimes through mutual fascination between cultures that viewed one another as strange, alluring, or even forbidden. For many Crusaders, meeting the women of the East was the moment when the Holy War stopped being an abstract mission and became a deeply personal encounter with a world far richer and more complex than anything they had known. Their real education wasn't on the battlefield. It began in the marketplaces, gardens, and candlelit rooms where East and West first met eye to eye. For many Crusaders, the first step into forbidden territory began quietly with a glance across a marketplace, a shared moment in a courtyard, or a conversation that lasted slightly too long in the shade of an olive tree. No banners unfurled, no trumpets announced it. But these small sparks often ignited into relationships that Latin priests would later call scandalous, immoral, or, in one dramatic case, evidence of the devil's whispering. But human hearts rarely obey sermons. Crusader vows were designed to keep knights focused on holy war, not romance. Yet vows are fragile things, especially under the Levantine sun. A lonely knight stationed far from home could find comfort in a smile, a shared joke, or the kindness of someone who saw beyond his armor. Many Eastern women, pragmatic and socially adept, recognized the emotional turbulence Crusaders carried. They offered hospitality, conversation, and companionship, gifts as powerful as any weapon. But these relationships weren't simple flirtations. They were dangerous. A Crusader caught with a local lover could face fines, penance, or open humiliation from the clergy. Priests preached that such liaisons threatened the purity of the crusade, insisting that desire weakened God's soldiers. Some knights were paraded before troops as examples, their armor removed, their shame displayed. Yet even public punishment didn't stop others from following the same path. And despite the church's fury, many Crusader commanders quietly looked the other way. They knew that men who faced starvation, disease, and siege warfare needed morale, and nothing eased the soul more effectively than a human connection. Some lords even encouraged relationships if it kept their troops stable and cooperative. But the real conflict arose in the hearts of the knights themselves. Many felt genuine love for the women they met. Others felt torn between duty and desire, unsure which path honored God more. The strict vow or the kindness of the woman who shared food, shelter, and comfort when war became unbearable. In whispered corners of barracks, knights confessed their fears to one another. Could a holy warrior also be a lover? Could a man serve God in battle yet find solace in forbidden arms at night? The truth was messy, human, and undeniable. For every vow broken, a story began. Of tenderness, betrayal, loyalty, or heartbreak. And each story revealed something deeper. Beneath the armor, crusaders were not symbols of purity, but flesh and blood men wrestling with the oldest temptation of all. Once crusaders settled into life in the Levant, their relationships with Eastern women evolved beyond fleeting encounters. What began as secret flirtations often became structured arrangements the church refused to acknowledge, but everyone else fully understood. Local communities, especially in cosmopolitan cities like Antioch and Jerusalem, adapted quickly to the new Latin presence. And so emerged a system of concubinage and temporary marriages that blurred the lines between affection, convenience, and cultural negotiation. For crusaders, concubinage offered stability. War was unpredictable, battles erupted with little warning, and disease lurked in every cramped encampment. Having a trusted companion, someone who could provide food, care, emotional support, and a sense of home, became invaluable. Many knights formed bonds with women who helped them survive the daily grind of crusader life. These were not always relationships built on lust. Often, they were partnerships forged in hardship, with genuine affection and interdependence growing over time. But concubinage had another dimension: practicality. Eastern societies, especially among Armenians and Syrians, had traditions of arranged temporary unions that allowed couples to be together without violating local customs. Crusaders unfamiliar with these systems often entered them without realizing just how official they were by local standards. A knight might think he had a discreet arrangement, only to discover later that her family considered him fully responsible financially, socially, or even legally. Some discovered this at dramatically inconvenient moments, like when a battle horn sounded and their casual companion expected a formal goodbye or a promise of support. The Latin clergy hated these relationships with enthusiastic intensity. Priests lashed out in sermons, accusing knights of weakening the crusading spirit, corrupting their souls, and dishonoring the mission. But their moral outrage had little impact. Crusaders were men who had marched across continents, lost comrades, starved during sieges, and faced death repeatedly. A warm home, a sympathetic ear, or even a sense of belonging in an unfamiliar world felt far more immediate than theological warnings. Families of Eastern women also saw opportunity. A crusader ally brought protection, wealth, and prestige. Some fathers arranged unions for political advantage, weaving their families into the new Latin power structure. Others hoped such connections would help protect their communities in chaotic times. The result was a complicated cultural ecosystem where romance, survival, negotiation, and scandal intertwined. A knight's concubine might be a lover, a caretaker, a political link, or all three at once. And slowly, these relationships reshaped the very identity of crusader society in the East, creating unions no one had expected and the church struggled desperately to control. As relationships between crusaders and Eastern women became more common, something emerged that neither the church nor the crusading commanders had prepared for: children. These boys and girls, born to Latin fathers and Armenian, Syrian, Greek, or Arab mothers, were the living proof of relationships everyone pretended didn't exist. And in a world defined by religious boundaries, noble bloodlines, and rigid social structures, their existence created complications that were as political as they were personal. To Western clerics, such children were an embarrassment. Crusader vows were supposed to prevent this exact outcome. Yet there they were, little ones with golden hair and Levantine features, running between tents, playing in courtyards, or clinging to their mothers' veils while their fathers marched off to battle. Priests complained in letters back to Europe that Latin men have sown confusion among the peoples of the East, which is medieval church language for, "They've been doing exactly what we told them not to do." But for the Crusaders themselves, the situation was profoundly human. Many knights who formed long-term relationships with local women treated their children with real affection. These weren't secret offspring. In many cases, they were beloved members of new blended households. A knight who lived for years in Antioch or Tripoli might find more comfort in his Levantine family than in the distant European world he had left behind. And for Eastern families, a child with a Latin father could be a symbol of alliance or protection. Such children often grew up bilingual, navigating both their mother's culture and the Latin customs introduced by their fathers. In some households, they were raised Christian. In others, they followed the mother's faith, creating a unique cultural fusion that blurred medieval boundaries in ways theologians hated but everyday life embraced. These children also shaped politics. Crusader states like the Principality of Antioch and the County of Edessa saw the rise of families with combined heritage. Local nobles married Latin commanders. Armenian princesses were wed to Crusader lords. Their children became living embodiments of blended traditions, diplomacy, and identities. Some found their calling as translators, negotiators, or soldiers, possessing an understanding of both East and West that surpassed the grasp of either civilization alone. Yet, life wasn't always harmonious. The deaths of crusaders in battle or their eventual return to Europe often left families in precarious situations. While some women found protection within their communities, others were thrust back into hardship. The Church, with its rigid doctrines, rarely acknowledged these unions, leaving mothers and children marginalized, excluded from official Latin structures. Nevertheless, for a fleeting moment in medieval history, these families represented something extraordinary. A subtle rebellion against the strict cultural boundaries, a testament that even amidst holy war, humanity's innate desire to connect and intertwine persisted, with love forging connections that the Crusades never intended and children ensuring that these bonds would endure. Not every relationship between Crusaders and Eastern women sprang from passion or loneliness. Many were deliberately crafted, shaped by ambition, political maneuvering, or the sheer need for survival. In the fluid, unpredictable landscape of the Crusader states, marriage transcended the realm of private affection, becoming a strategic instrument, a weapon, a shield, and, on occasion, a diplomatic miracle. And while these unions stirred controversy in Europe, they were often celebrated in the East. When the Crusaders carved out their new kingdoms, Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, Jerusalem, they quickly confronted a stark reality. They were vastly outnumbered. Latin Christians represented a tiny minority ruling over a diverse tapestry of Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, Arabs, Maronites, Jacobites, and countless others. To survive, they needed alliances, and these alliances were often cemented through marriage. Suddenly, the knight who had once sworn vows of chastity in a monastery found himself negotiating with noble families who saw him as a valuable asset in the political game. Armenian nobles, in particular, were eager to forge such ties. Their daughters married Crusader lords, creating powerful hybrid families that seamlessly blended Western feudalism with Eastern courtly traditions. These women brought with them dowries, local influence, and crucial knowledge of languages, customs, and regional politics. A Latin lord might arrive in Antioch as a foreigner, but after marrying an Armenian or Syrian noblewoman, he became firmly rooted in the local social, economic, and military landscape. And for the women, these marriages could offer a degree of protection. Crusader armies were unpredictable forces, and aligning with a Latin lord brought a measure of security in turbulent times. Some Eastern families saw these unions as a golden bridge connecting the old power structures with the new authority. Others hoped their daughters could moderate Latin behavior, a task at which some succeeded, and many failed spectacularly, with scandal always lurking in the shadows. The Latin Church frowned upon marriages conducted without proper approval, especially when the woman belonged to a different Christian tradition, or even worse, another faith entirely. Priests bitterly complained that Eastern brides bewitched Crusaders, diverting them from Latin customs, medieval clerical language for, "She has influence we do not." Yet, despite these protests, many Crusader nobles openly adored their Eastern wives, praising their intelligence, loyalty, and political acumen. Cultural fusion followed. Castles filled with a blend of European and Levantine furniture. Meals featured Western bread alongside Eastern spices. Children were raised speaking multiple languages, trained to inherit thrones across hybrid kingdoms. The Crusader states began to resemble less of a transplanted Europe and more of a new world shaped by interwoven identities. These marriages blurred the lines between conqueror and local elite, transforming knights into regional lords, foreign invaders into family men, and holy war into a series of unintended social revolutions. And in every union, scandal and opportunity walked hand in hand. If battlefield romances and practical unions caused quiet gossip among soldiers, then scandals among the Crusader nobility triggered full-blown political earthquakes. In the courts of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Tripoli, love affairs didn't just spark whispers. They toppled alliances, ignited feuds, and occasionally dragged entire armies into conflict. Crusader courts were pressure cookers of ambition, fear, desire, and deeply fragile egos. Add the complexity of Eastern customs and Latin moral expectations, and suddenly a single romance could threaten the stability of an entire state. Take Antioch, a principality notorious for its political chaos. There, Latin lords governed alongside Armenian, Greek, and Syrian nobles, all vying for power and influence. A Latin knight caught in an affair with a local noblewoman wasn't simply breaking his vows. He was interfering with delicate alliances. Families demanded compensation. Clerics demanded repentance. Commanders demanded an explanation for why their most promising officer was sneaking into a courtyard at night instead of preparing for the next military campaign. In some cases, these affairs became legendary. Chronicles recount relationships between Crusader princes and widows of local rulers, between Western nobles and daughters of Eastern generals, and even between high-ranking Latin clergy and women they definitely should not have been visiting. These affairs often intertwined genuine affection with political ambition. A noblewoman with deep local ties could dramatically elevate a Crusader lord's influence, but only if handled with discretion. When handled poorly, scandal followed like a curse. Jealousy was another potent force shaping the Crusader world. Knights competed fiercely for prestige, and when romance entered the equation, competition turned volatile. Duels erupted. Alliances fractured. Some commanders outright refused to work with rivals whose relationships threatened military unity. Even kings weren't immune. The royal court of Jerusalem occasionally resembled a Byzantine drama more than a holy kingdom. Eastern families also played a significant role. A Crusader affair with a noblewoman wasn't merely a personal matter. It was political currency. Her relatives might support the union or condemn it, depending on how it served their interests. Some women embraced such relationships to secure protection or enhance their influence. Others found themselves trapped between Latin ambition and local honor codes, forced to navigate expectations no one had prepared them for. Amidst all this, the Latin clergy attempted to impose control, but their influence often waned in the face of raw human emotion. Love, desire, and ambition didn't heed sermons. They obeyed the logic of hearts under pressure and hearts entangled in the intricate politics of a fragile society. In this world, an affair wasn't just a scandal. It was a spark that could ignite a principality. As Crusader romances became more commonplace, ranging from simple concubinage to strategic political marriages and full-blown court scandals, the Latin Church realized it faced a significant problem, a very human, very stubborn problem. The clergy had sailed east expecting to guide holy warriors toward salvation. Instead, they found themselves lecturing knights who were sharing homes, children, and sometimes entire lives with Eastern women. And what alarmed them most was that these knights didn't seem remotely remorseful. The Church responded with predictable fury. Councils were convened in the Crusader states. Bishops thundered from pulpits, accusing knights of polluting the crusading spirit and ensnaring themselves in the clutches of foreign women. Priests issued new rules forbidding unofficial unions, condemning marriages performed outside Latin rites, and demanding that crusaders immediately abandon their concubines. The anger was so intense that some clerics even lobbied for the excommunication of any knight who persisted in such relationships. But reality rendered enforcement nearly impossible. Crusader armies were stretched thin. Garrison towns relied heavily on local cooperation, and many commanders quietly believed that a soldier with a stable home, even an unofficial one, fought more effectively than a lonely, angry, restless one. Why send a knight into battle miserable when he could march knowing someone awaited him on the outskirts of Antioch or Jerusalem? So, the clergy's crackdown created a peculiar dynamic, public condemnation juxtaposed with private tolerance. Priests continued their scolding. Knights continued visiting their lovers. Letters to Europe lamented the moral decay, while in the Levant, life simply went on. The Church's attempts at enforcement sometimes backfired spectacularly. One bishop in the early 1100s ordered knights to immediately dismiss their Eastern partners. Instead, dozens of soldiers protested, threatening to abandon their garrisons entirely. Others flatly refused, insisting they would not cast out the women who had sustained them through sieges and sickness. The bishop, realizing he had nearly triggered a mutiny, retreated faster than a man pursued by cavalry. Eastern Christian communities also resisted clerical pressure. Armenian and Syriac churches informally recognized many of these unions, arguing that if the couple lived as husband and wife, then God surely recognized their bond, even if Latin priests chose to ignore it. Over time, the clergy settled into a state of uneasy resignation. They issued condemnations, but the relationships endured, and beneath the veneer of official disapproval, something remarkable occurred. The Crusader states developed a hybrid culture, one that was neither fully Western nor fully Eastern, shaped by bonds that the Church struggled to categorize. Love had forged alliances stronger than sermons, and desire had reshaped a society originally intended to be purely holy. By the time decades had passed and the Crusader states had settled into their precarious existence, a surprising truth had become undeniable. It wasn't solely battles, castles, or treaties that defined the Latin kingdoms in the East. It was relationships, the clandestine romances, the forbidden unions, the political marriages, the blended families. All of them left marks deeper than any sword stroke. These bonds, dismissed by the Church as mere distractions or sins, proved to be one of the most influential forces in Crusader society. Walk through the streets of 12th century Antioch or Jerusalem, and you would encounter a world unlike anything in medieval Europe. Markets teemed with women wearing veils and men clad in chainmail. Children spoke Arabic and Old French in the same sentence. Houses were adorned with a mixture of Latin crosses and Eastern icons. Kitchens prepared stews spiced with cumin alongside loaves of European bread. Even the architecture reflected this fusion, with European fortifications rising above neighborhoods laid out in ancient Levantine patterns. This hybrid society didn't emerge from brilliant policies crafted by kings. It arose because knights fell in love. Crusader families of mixed heritage became cultural bridges, translating languages, mediating disputes, guiding Western newcomers through Levantine customs, and forging diplomatic ties that armies could never achieve. A Latin noble with a Syrian or Armenian wife suddenly gained access to networks of local nobles, merchants, clergy, and soldiers who would otherwise have remained inaccessible. And the children, they became the vibrant heart of a new identity. These boys and girls grew up navigating multiple worlds, learning Western chivalry and Eastern etiquette before they were old enough to wield a sword. Some became soldiers who understood the terrain better than any newcomer. Others became advisors who could interpret both the Bible and the Quran. A few even rose to positions of power, ruling over domains where their very existence symbolized cultural fusion. Of course, not all legacies were peaceful. Scandals left lasting wounds. Some relationships crumbled when Crusaders returned to Europe, abandoning families behind. Others ignited feuds or jealous rivalries that persisted for years. Yet, even these painful stories shaped the emotional landscape of the Latin East, a place forever suspended between love and conflict. In the end, the Crusader states were never purely European colonies, nor were they purely Eastern societies. They were something in between, forged not only by holy war but by the quiet, complicated, undeniably human connections made in its shadow. Love defied vows, desire transcended borders, and together they sculpted a world that neither side could have foreseen. A world born from scandal, but sustained by the hearts of those who lived within it.